Hi, this is Mike Livermore, and with me today is Willis Jenkins, who's the John Allen Hollingsworth Professor of Ethics and the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. His work focuses on the environmental humanities, and he can often be found in transdisciplinary collaborations, tackling hard questions related to how humans understand and interact with the natural world. Willis, thanks for joining me today.
Mike, it's a pleasure to be here.
Just to get us started, I was curious, what brought you to this intersection of religion, ethics, and the environment where you've spent your career kind of thinking about these issues?
Yeah, no, fair question. And I suppose like many questions that come to mid-career academics who have made kind of a transition, there's a long story behind it. But the short of it is, more or less, that I trained in religious ethics with a focus on environmental issues, and in a kind of conventional way. That is like how did a few big Christian traditions reason historically about human-environment relations, and what kind of implications would that have for contemporary environmental issues? And then, my first job was I was at Yale Divinity School with an appointment also in the forestry school, and I realized I didn't have a lot of really helpful, interesting things to say to the people in the forestry environment school about particular problems. And yet I thought that someone with my training should be able to. And so, I really started focusing on just trying to get involved in not just sort of like the cultural translation of issues, but really a kind of humanistic contribution to how problems are interpreted from the beginning, how they're designed from the beginning. Coming to UVA in an environmental humanities position has really kind of opened that up.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a lot of different ways that I think we could take our conversation. But one thing that just kind of comes to mind that sometimes troubles me when we talk about the humanities is that it strikes me as a weird way of carving up the joints in academia, that I'm not sure that historians and philosophers have all that much in common with each other, and we put them under this rubric of the humanities. And do you think that that's a category that's worthwhile, or is it just like all other intellectual disciplines that aren't, the sciences?
Yeah, Andres Clarence, who's an engineer, and he's on our Environmental Resilience Institute, said, I basically think of the university as engineering and everything else is religious studies, which is his way. He was joking, of course, but it was also his way of saying, humanities, social sciences, whatever. It's all just kind of like squishy non-math is what.
Right. Non-quantitative disciplines, right?
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. And I think especially in this field where there's a sort of interdisciplinary interpretation of environmental issues, and we're trying to think about how to find collaborations of sciences and economics, especially sciences and economics, and also engineering and design to some extent. Arts and humanities becomes kind of a box. And I think sort of two ways about it. I mean, actually, I'm speaking directly from the experience of being on a panel, the president's panel about how UVA should invest in resilience and sustainability yesterday. And I was the lone humanities guy out of like 20 people. And, the questions were coming kind of like, what can the humanities be? What should they do? And on the one hand, I'm really happy to talk about the need for research that is attentive to a wide range of cultural interpretations, that is, methodologically imaginative, that can engage the arts and invite public imagination, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I hear your point. I think it's a pretty loose coalition from people who really don't share research methods.
Yeah. And it's funny, too. I was thinking about this because also the social science, I don't think of the social sciences as falling within the rubric of the humanities. Sometimes it gets put in there. But one thing I think is funny is if you call a social scientist a humanist, they would get very angry. And if you call a humanist a social scientist, they would get very angry. And so I think that the fact that they get lumped together, neither one of them likes that. So maybe that's a way of saying that maybe the category doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it may well not. Yeah.
Yeah. But on the environment, one of the things, that is especially fun about your work and some of your recent work, especially is, trying to make these interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross humanities and sciences collaborations work and generate product and not just, be a panel or a talk session, but actually, create real intellectual contributions and real intellectual progress. And so maybe, it's more illuminating to talk about some of these abstract academic issues in the context of real projects that you've worked on. So one that we have chatted about in the past a little bit is this project on water. And this is a huge interdisciplinary group. It's hugely interdisciplinary. The group is good sized. It's not massive, but it's hugely interdisciplinary in the sense of folks from the hard sciences. There's a lawyer in the group, economics, engineering, religious studies, and so on. And I was curious just about what kind of how that project got started and what the project is about. Let's kind of start with that. It's about water rights in general. But what's the kind of the specific interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary perspective that that you saw was missing and that this group was kind of forged to help address?
Yeah, so this group came out of an initiative from UVA's Environmental Resilience Institute that was broadly themed on water futures, but there was a particular team they wanted to work on water security. And I mean, this will get directly to your question about what do the humanities do. I sit on the ERI board, and I played what is often my role, which was to say, like, well, what's so great about water security? Like, why not a different concept? Like, why not water justice? And why not water sovereignty? Look at all the ways of thinking about water that the discourse of water security excludes. And Karen, the director of the ERI, kind of called me on it. She's like, basically like, okay, smarty pants humanities guy, how about you co-direct a team on water security then? But that does express what my worry was, that some of the concepts that organize research, especially environmental change research, that can be taken as common sense, have a kind of unreflective normative frame to them. And it's not that I'm an ethicist. It's not that I dislike the normative frame. It's that I want there to be responsibility for how the problem is framed right from the beginning. And then also, in this context, it wasn't, my stance wasn't that you can't use the phrase water security, but let's ask, to what extent can you begin to include some of the cultural valuations of water that have historically been excluded from international water security discourse. And so, yeah, we really tried to push the envelope on that. Yeah,
it's so, in a way, there's almost a kind of a philosophy of science element to some of this stuff. You get, I think, as a quote unquote humanist that gets pulled into these conversations, you get asked to play some different roles, again, in part due to the kind of open-ended nature of what we mean when we refer to the humanities. And so it's a little bit about questioning concepts from almost from a scientific perspective to say, like, are these the right ways of thinking about these problems to make progress on them scientifically, but also, normatively, how are we thinking about these issues? Are there unstated normative assumptions or undefended or undefendable, for that matter, normative assumptions? So just to kind of get into the details of this project, what is the concept of water security, and how has it been used, and what do we mean, like what is meant by that, and how is it structured, scientific inquiry or kind of policy conversations?
Yeah, so actually we were really fortunate to bring in probably one of the best authorities in the world on the history of the water security concept, Jeremy Schmidt. And he joined the team and really helped sort of frame its significance. But, I think just really basically, it would be fair to say that water security has been thought as securing the minimum quantity of water for, what humans need, right? Like in the most efficient way generally. And so there's this kind of constant, or maybe the main pull in existing water security discourse would be the tension between the efficiency of water distribution versus the universality of making sure that every single human's water needs are met.
Got it. So in a way, we could is it fair to analogize it to a concept like food security,
exactly,
or even like economic security when we're talking about, just the idea that there's human needs, and what matters is ensuring some stable and broad accessibility to whatever the resource. Energy security could be another one.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, and so then the other lead on this project is Paolo Dorico, who's he's a hydrologist. He's a chair of environmental sciences at UC Berkeley, and his work is really about the quantitative hydrology of water security as embodied in food. And so his big point is like, look, so much of the water that humans need is not like the water that comes out of the tap or that we need for drinking and bathing, but really it's most of the water we use is in food, right? And so his work is really focused around quantifying flows of water that are implicit in food.
Yeah, so just to get into some of this conceptual space, so what is the difference between, say, a concept like water security, which strikes me as deeply normative, really, kind of on its face, but maybe, of course, having clear scientific or engineering kind of implications, because we could evaluate a system, a real hydrological system or a real built environment to ask, what are the consequences for water security of X thing that we're evaluating? How does that differ from using a frame like water justice or water rights in this evaluative posture of kind of taking what we know about the natural world and engineering and science and so forth, and then kind of understanding whether we're making good or bad decisions, which I take to be the evaluative posture.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would put it this way. What we wanted to do was create a quantitative model where it would be possible to visualize what water security looks like under different value regimes. So that is to say, if you go all in on water security as being defined by universal human rights, this is what you get. And maybe the key thing here was we wanted to find some way of expressing important values for water that, I guess you could say, care for the water itself. Like, what if the river is sacred, right? Or what if the water has rights of its own? Or what if the ecological benefits, services, communities that are sustained by water are seen as, not just desirable, but let us say like foundationally important to a community's identity, such that they should be bound up into water security? How could we express that? So I mean, that was the key innovative thing we're trying to do, so that you could begin to compare different ideas of water security within the same volumetric framework.
So you could ask, I mean, just to, a concrete example of where there's different types of interests at play would be something like on the West Coast, there's often conflict between agriculture and like endangered species requirements.
Exactly. Yeah. And
so, there's frequently questions about what are the minimum flows necessary in a river to protect like salmon spawning grounds, and the advocates for the endangered species will have one set of water flows that they're going to advocate for, and then the agricultural interests will say, no, we need this water, the salmon don't need that much, or we shouldn't care about the salmon at all. And of course, in the U.S., there's a legal framework to ensure the minimum water flows that aren't going to jeopardize the species. But we can ask things like, is this protected? If the salmon have some kind of right, if they're they have some interest that we ought to respect, what does that look like? And I guess what it sounds like from the project that you're describing is that the goal wasn't to answer those kinds of hard normative questions, but just to say, we can build a model that, depending on how you answer those normative questions, then the model can tell you something about what water flows should look like.
Yes. And that was the idea. So it wasn't an optimizing equation. There are equations in there, but they're not optimizing in the sense that if you plug in the values and you get like the best answer. But it's really if you begin with some articulation of the values that inform ostensibly inform your notion or a community's notion of water security, this is the kind of volume trade-offs you would get. And I would say, so we've been talking, I mean, this has been kind of framed like what can the humanities bring to environmental change research? But I experience this also as a really salutary challenge because to me, from a more humanities-based approach, because to work with a hydrologist, Paolo he's so interested, so open to philosophy, really excited to read in environmental ethics, and so his question was, it wasn't hard to convince him that hydrology should take account of intrinsic value theories or indigenous studies theories. And his immediate question was like, okay, so what would be what should be our proxy for that, right? Like how much water flow should we put for appropriately respecting, the intrinsic value of a waterway? And then, that then is a kind of, it's forcing a kind of evaluative approach to really think in a quantitative way about how do these values get expressed. And so, of course, we picked a few proxies, like 80% flow, 20% flow. But that's the kind of political work that, ideally a deliberative watershed community would undertake.
Right. And one of the things that's also interesting about this, I think, too, is it highlights this intersection of values and science in a way that's very explicit. And I think beneficial for that reason. There are other environmental contexts where we kind of subsume the value choices into the scientific inquiry. We kind of pretend like what we're doing is we're just answering a scientific question. Like, for example, what water flows are necessary to achieve water security. And then we go to a bunch of scientists and say, answer the question for us, please, and tell us, and then we'll develop policies accordingly. But as you point out, that's a deeply normative question, and so it's kind of almost inappropriate or unfair to kick that to the scientists and expect them to give us an answer, or at the very least, it puts them in an extremely awkward position because there are these embedded normative questions that we'd be much better served by. At least, from a deliberative perspective, by having the science answer, in a sense, what the science can answer, but then being more explicit about how that connects up to these deeper value questions.
Yes, yeah, completely. I always wince in empathy for the scientists when I hear politicians say, well, the science has said X, and so therefore we must do Y, and it's really unfair.
Yeah, it's tough, and this comes up in climate debates all the time. Let's just do what the science says. And it's sometimes my friends who say that, right? And it's frustrating. I think there is a reason why some advocates and politicians are inclined to say things like that, which is they want to make it seem as though what's going on is not a contest of values, but is instead, just a simple question of fact. So, get thinking of the context of the water rights research, you could have this really fancy model where everyone kind of agrees on the science, which would be like nirvana in today's political discourse, right? So we were like, okay, we all agree that this model is an accurate representation of water flows and that kind of thing. But what we really disagree about is the relative value of, people's property rights and agricultural interests versus, whether the salmon have some interest that we ought to respect in their own right versus, traditional indigenous people's relationships to this water. And that's what we really disagree about. Now what do we do?
Right.
So what's the answer? Like, what do we do? Like, have we been helped by the model if what we end up ultimately recognizing is that we have deep, maybe insoluble values disagreements?
Yeah. Well, so it's a fair question, especially given the state of our current democratic capacity to have meaningful conversation across significant value differences. But if I can answer from my commitments, I would say I think that's in the long run better to know where the differences lie, rather than kind of obscuring them. inside of either an economic model or a scientific model, because they're going to come out eventually, right? I think it's better. I mean, I think it's better.
Yeah.
I would like to think it's better for a pluralist democracy to figure out how to be a democracy amidst deep, irreconcilable pluralism than to hide its conflicts.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I want to agree with you.
Yeah, right.
But to just play the devil's advocate, you could actually imagine that, that kind of the argument that runs, well, look, at some level, these are really deep disagreements. And we, again, kind of as you said, we live in a pluralistic society. We want people we like that pluralistic society in a sense, right? We certainly like our own rights to decide how to live our lives and what counts for the good life. And we're going to disagree with each other. There are ways that we can frame questions that turn those disagreements into hot disagreements that get people angry and inflame their kind of identity and affiliation and are oriented towards in-group and out-group kind of ways of thinking about the world. And then there are ways of framing disputes that are jargon-laden and technocratic and difficult to understand. And people just say, that's boring, and I'm going to go watch sports and hang out with my family. And maybe we can, and you disagree with me, but I don't even understand what we're talking about. So let's have a beer.
Yeah, I appreciate, Mike. I have a lot of sympathy for the technocratic view. Yeah. On the other hand, I think then I think it can lead then to the kind of alienation that you see around climate, right? Like a bunch of people are doing some stuff I don't understand to, whatever it is, like take my freedoms or whatever Americans are saying now.
Raise my energy prices.
Right.
I mean, in fairness, it's like if your energy prices are going to go up, we should probably give you a good reason why that's
going. Yeah. Right. And it shouldn't require you to understand an integrated assessment model. Right?
Probably not. Right. And the trust the experts thing gets, so that's interesting. So the trust the experts thing gets thin when we're talking about like real world implications on people's lives. We want to be able to, but then again, just to, continue to play the devil's advocate here, your energy prices are going to go up. And we could say, well, the reason your energy prices are going to go up is because we've made contestable value judgments about the relative importance of future generations versus current generations, where you sit in society versus where other people sit in society, our responsibilities and, rights vis-a-vis the global community. And we've made those decisions that are deeply value laden, and that's going to determine how much your energy prices are going to go up. Or mumbo jumbo, trust the experts, don't worry about it. That's why your energy prices are going to go up. And I do wonder which one of those ultimately is more conducive to, again, just kind of getting along with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, this is not something that I am an expert in, this sort of like cultural cognition bit. I mean, I certainly do think, I'm interested. I don't really know which way to go on that. I mean, I'm really interested in that question. I think, again, like from my own intellectual commitments, the way I would like to answer is that, you hope that that people can be motivated by their commitments. Maybe not like 100%, but enough that you accept a higher energy bill because you acknowledge that you care for future generations or something like that.
Right.
And I think that that's plausible. I think I'm among those who are skeptical of especially climate policy, and I guess also water policy, always being delivered to the public in terms of self-interest, like this will be better for you because you're going to avoid some really terrible thing, or you're going to, have 1 million green jobs or whatever. And maybe that, but also ask people to be who they want to be, right? Like you want to be, like there's incredible bipartisan support about being the kind of people who care for future generations. Like that's not really a controversial value. It's controversial like what it means, of course. But I would like to think that that's a commitment that could lead to some practical policy implication, including that your gas is more expensive.
Right. And maybe the thing is that we don't, ideally, we wouldn't necessarily have to agree with the choices that are made, but we would, because we're not going to, because we live in a pluralistic democracy. And the chances that my preferred policies are going to be the ones that are adopted are roughly 1 out of 330 million.
Right.
And so what I'm supposed to, I think the way this is supposed to work is that I'm supposed to accede to the choices that are made and recognize, in part because there are values, but in part, that are roughly commensurate with my values. I recognize them as the kind of values that people have, even if they're not exactly the ones that reflect my relative weighing of different interests. But I recognize that there's a democratic process that we all have a voice in, and ultimately what comes out of that is a view that I am committed to that democratic process because it respects my voice in some equal way. And I think one of the tricky things these days is that people have questions about that.
Yeah, well said.
So then just the other part of this that I was curious to get your thoughts on is, of course, we're talking about kind of sometimes people refer to as sociological legitimacy, right? Do people actually accept the the outputs of a political process? But there's also kind of normative legitimacy, like is it actually defendable as a democratic practice to throw mumbo jumbo at people and as a way of getting them to be compliant, as opposed to explaining the true grounds of our decisions?
Yeah. So just to refer back to this again, this panel that UVA had yesterday, they asked a number of us to reflect on the relation of climate and democracy, because that's like it's the area they want to invest in. And so my little team of 3 people, we basically said, well, it seems like the question here is, can democracies survive climate change? Or maybe to put it better, are democratic societies possessed of the capacities to respond well to climate change? Or is it is it just so overwhelming, the temporality is so misaligned with, the temporalities of political processes, the incentive structure across generations is just so perverse, whatever it is, all the things, right? That democracies just are really ill-equipped for it, and maybe you kind of need the technocratic mumbo jumbo as a way of fudging it. I don't know. I would feel bad if I was making that argument, but I would certainly be open to hearing it.
I mean, if it's true, it's true. I mean, that kind of thing is empirical, right?
Right.
And we shouldn't just, and this is a tricky thing, is to have our commitments, but we don't want to engage in wishful thinking.
Yeah.
Right. Which is tricky.
Yeah.
So another really interesting project that you've been engaged in recently is this Coastal Futures Conservatory. And I think of this, so if the Water Rights Project is about taking, let's say, perspectives drawn from the humanities and using those perspectives to help, in this project really highlight the underlying normative values that are driving conversations about, particular environmental question, water security in that case, and untangle the normative and the empirical and the scientific and the cultural. What I take the Coastal Futures Conservatory is about, well, you tell me what it's about. It strikes me as a little bit about translation. It strikes me as a little bit about, broadening the techniques of scientific inquiry in a way that's more inclusive. But maybe you could just describe what the project is and then how you see how it relates to this broader science humanities set of issues.
Yeah, so Coastal Futures Conservatory is a kind of a little UVA startup funded by an internal grant that has been asked to think about integrating arts and humanities into Virginia's really world-class coastal research program. So UVA leads an NSF-funded long-term ecological research site called the Virginia Coast Reserve along the eastern shore of Virginia, and it's just a great place to study the ecological dynamics of coastal resilience, because it's the largest undisturbed barrier island system in the world, and also a place that is experiencing sea level rise at 3 times the global average, and so you just get lots of dynamics that it's a great laboratory for scientists interested in this. And so knowing that, wanting to build environmental humanities into environmental change research generally around UVA, this is a great place to think with, and the staff and the scientists there were really interested. They wanted to know, how can we have arts and humanities more involved here. Basically, a lot of conversations with a music professor named Matthew Bertner, who specializes in ecoacoustics. We decided to call our project a conservatory, a school of music, and to foreground listening ways in. And so that means listening across disciplines and listening across borders, but also literally listening. And so one of my favorite examples is we sonify the data sets that are produced by the VCR scientists. So Matthew and his graduate students will take a data set, like on water quality in a particular area, and then basically translate that into a sonic signature. Take a huge CSV file and use machines to assign particular sounds to each data point, and then you can listen to it. And then, of course, then depending on your method of ecoacoustics, and Mike, I know more about methods in ecoacoustics than I really would have anticipated. But depending on it, then you begin to work with that. You might compose with it or manipulate it in some way so that it begins to sound a particular way. And so then when the public, I've also had this experience. When you look at a visual graph of temporal data plotted over time, you take it in an instant, right? Especially carbon emissions over 50 years or whatever. But if you listen to it, you really have to attend to the temporality and to the change in it over time, because you're sitting there for even if it's just 30 seconds, you experience that in a certain way. You really have to attend to it, and I think it invites a different kind of cognition. And so anyway, that's one kind of listening, and then there's other parts. There's another number of other components to this conservatory, but we also kind of commissioned typical humanities-based research from a historian, literary scholars, and then that informs these kind of multidisciplinary performances that Matthew really orchestrates, so that an audience can come. And we've had a number of performances. An audience can come and experience a concert, but that it's informed by coastal sciences, it's informed by indigenous studies, it's informed by ethics. And I don't know, I don't have any kind of data on this, but what I imagine that we're doing is that we're inviting a broader range of imaginative cultural response to what we know about rapid coastal change.
Yeah, it's real. It's so interesting. And I think, one distinction I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on with respect to this project is sometimes in these conversations on the humanities and the environment, especially for folks who don't necessarily have, are new to the idea of thinking about the humanities, they almost can think of the role as being like you would hire a communications expert for.
Yeah.
Right? It's a way of communicating the science to the public. And that's fine. I don't know that humanities scholars are who I would tap for that particular job.
Not always known for being the most accessible communicators.
Right. These are people who literally write out what they're going to say before standing up at a podium and reading their essays, right? And so, but what I've thought of as a kind of alternative to that is sophisticated meaning making. It's not about necessarily communicating as a kind of a pre-generated message and just figuring out how to, get that message across. It's this process of meaning making. I'm just curious what you think of that alternative, or you think there's something slightly adjacent to that, or totally different from it.
No, I appreciate that. I really resist the idea that the humanities should be involved in environmental change research to translate to the public. Yeah, A, because it's a bad idea, and B, because I hope that we're doing something more creative. And in this case, I'm saying arts and humanities. We're really kind of really foregrounding music as a way in here. And so I'm just say, let me give you two examples of how involving the arts and humanities has invited meaning making, as you say. I like that. So one is on the Eastern Shore, there's a place, a local museum called the Barrier Island Center that is really devoted to remembering the lost social life of the set of when the Barrier Islands offshore were settled. They were settled by settler people, but after indigenous folks used them through the 19th century up until about 1933, when there was a series of hurricanes, and they were just like, no, we're leaving. So they left, and then there's this museum that's dedicated to it. And so we, among all these exhibits about what fishing was like and what the hotel was like and so on, we made these sound installations. So people could come in and they could pick up headphones and they would listen to like a sonification of sea level rise over time or something like that, right? And then next to it there was just a very short little placard that explained the science that went into the data that was created, and just a note about how the sonification was made. And there's nothing else said, There's nothing else be like, and look, sea level rise is really threatening the eastern shore, and you need to think about what this community is going to do. Like, no white paper kind of communication, right? And again, unscientific response here, but the first of all, the opening was really well attended, and there was just like a real excitement, like a buzz, People would put on their headphones and their eyes would widen and they would kind of look up and smile. And like, I don't know what's happening in their mind, but I just think, well, in some way they are participating in the meaning making of what to make of the science of coastal change in this place. And they are connecting it right, literally in the place of historical memory of kind of radical social change in response to coastal vulnerability. And I think, I just think that's of a higher order. Now, like the next step, I would, if we could keep this going, I would love to then find ways to invite and participate in more community meaning making along those lines. And we've done some things like we did like a writing workshop, and there was a artist workshop for local artists to do some stuff with the ghost forest there. And we have I should say we have a major indigenous storytelling project for indigenous experiences of coastal change. It's kind of extraordinary. So all that is sort of inviting community meaning making, I'd say. But then on the other, this other side of what this is, how this has changed the way that we researchers at UVA research the coast. So we have, about once a year we gather all the related researchers, scientists, humanists, and artists. And Matthew, the musician, does a kind of eco-acoustics listening workshop, and he makes people go out and take microphones and field recorders and basically undertake meditative listening exercises in place. And the first time we did this, I was really worried. I just thought, this project is going to fail right from the beginning, because the scientists are going to think this is exactly what happens when you invite arts and humanities over. Like, you start doing these weird, contemplative listening. Like, this is not research, Right. But so Karen McGlathery, who's the lead scientist for this place, comes back after a half an hour of directed listening, and she says, every single researcher needs to do this exercise. And it was because she thought she would be bored. I work here all the time. I'm not going to learn anything. And she experienced it differently. She paid attention to different things. And then, we brought back recordings just explaining what we were doing to people at UVA. And one of the oyster reef scientists, Matt Reidenbach, listened to a recording of an oyster reef, and he goes, I bet we could build a way of, I bet I could answer the questions I have about oyster reef vitality, basically, by some acoustic metrics. And so we built this, we didn't, but some music grad students and some of Matthew's grad students built an acoustic monitoring thing, and they got some publications out of it about how to, and it was just, you can't kind of predict that, but it's just when you're invited to attend to something through a different disciplinary lens, that it allows new kinds of research questions to open up.
Yeah, that's a great story. And in a way, it's almost like, I'm trying to think of an analogy, but it's like, we worry about monocropping in agriculture, and one of the ways that we address that is we keep around heritage breeds of various things. And it's almost like one thing you could think of is the humanities as a storehouse of kind of heritage breeds of intellectual inquiry. And occasionally it's good to just take some of those seeds and throw them out into the more monoculturish disciplines and just disrupt them a little bit, and sometimes good things come out of that.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor, Mike. I'll have to use that one.
So on this, I think this notion of coastal change and that you've been digging into here. And this is a bit of a left field question, but something been on my mind recently that you may have some thoughts on from this experience. As climate change sets in, one of the big questions that societies here in the U.S., our society, cultures here and then around the world are going to face is this question of retreat. We're going to lose coastal lands. Coastal lands are going to really radically change. And this is a massive social problem, a cultural, political, economic. I mean, this is going to be a very big deal. And we've seen, just the leading edge of some of these questions show up after you see a major storm, come through, and then people will talk a little bit about, do we rebuild, do we not rebuild, what does that look like, and so on. And I wonder, and what struck me when you were kind of telling the story of the museum is there was a retreat there, right? There was a group that had a thriving community, it sounds like, and then ultimately decided to leave in the face of environmental risks that they face, environmental vulnerabilities, and then there's a relationship between this kind of retreat and remembering, and I'm just wondering if you have any insights from this experience about the broader set of questions of how to manage this. What I take to be just an incredibly difficult set of questions that we're all going to start to really seriously face.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, if I can just answer really generally, I would say it's going to be a huge site that needs really well-informed interpretive research because, just the amount of cultural memory and loss that is happening already in I guess environmentally stressed human migrations. It's massive. So, that's to put it in negative. There's also like incredible new forms of cultural exchange and cultural flows, right? So that, that's going to make a real difference in sort of what ideas and practices and foods, all that stuff, what goes where, and then how the places that have been left are remembered. I mean, just, think about the repertoire we have of homeland and exile. And how it affects our ongoing, political life in the United States, but, in various ways, different political lives everywhere. Okay, so we're going to have a whole new generation of homeland and exile stories. We'll have unknown political consequences. So that's really, really broad. But when I think about the question of what's going to happen along the coasts just in the next few decades, I think, here's a place in which there needs to be, multi-method, humanities involved research, because if you do whatever it is, like saline incursion models or something like that, you can get a sense of like, okay, where is the arable land going to retreat to? And then maybe you can overlay that with an economic model, like, what's the most efficient way to retreat from these places? But none of that's really going to match up with what people find to be culturally tolerable, or the stories that they're going to tell about why they left, right. And what those stories are going to do later. And, I can't say that like if you involve a humanities researcher that then you can answer those questions, but you can at least begin to let the other forms of research be informed by that. Right.
You can start to track it. You can recognize that that's one of the consequences of all of this. Well, to shift gears a little bit and to maybe bring some of the conversation to more of the religious studies side of your work. Another really fun, again, interdisciplinary project that we both know folks who have been part of is the work that you've done on this kind of these sanctuaries or these sacred spaces around the world, which sounds like a lot of fun and also very interesting research. So maybe again, you could kind of introduce what that work is, the Sanctuary Lab, and what some of the work that you've done there, and maybe how it fits into this broader question about religion and how religious ways of thinking interact with kind of environmental change, climate change, and the like.
Yeah, so Sanctuary Lab, it's another transdisciplinary experiment, and it involves people from arts, sciences, humanities interested in how planetary stresses are interpreted and experienced in places regarded as sacred in some way by some community. And the idea there is that, again, big global problems are going to be experienced in particular ways according to different particular inheritances. And so I'm always kind of looking for a way into that. And one way in is to start with how places that are set apart in the imagination and maybe also in politics as special are interpreted when they begin to change. And so actually the first place we went to was Yellowstone National Park. And you might think, well, wait, Yellowstone, I thought this was a religion project, but it was great. It was like taking the methods of religious studies to treat Yellowstone as a kind of secular sanctuary, a place that's been sacralized by the American wilderness tradition and its pieties. And that when folks go there, they're often invited to experience the place with that kind of regard, a place that is set apart and where the wilderness sublime can, cure your soul. Well, and really a place is, in the American wilderness tradition, a refuge from the rest of society. But now, Yellowstone is like a crucible of climate change in North America because it's one of the places most vulnerable to fire. And we actually talked with a climate modeler of Yellowstone. And his research, he had published research that showed that basically all of Yellowstone is projected to burn.
Oh gosh!
Burn at such a rate that it will not be able to sustain its forest within.
Right.
I don't remember his research, but I want to say 50 years.
Oh wow!
And so he presented this in like a austere scientific way, but he knew that we were from religious studies, or at least the directors were from religious studies, and then he wanted to say what this meant to him. And he started talking about, Muir and Emerson and how I think destabilizing it was for him to think that this place of pure nature was that vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So then we also took a different research team, including your colleague John Cannon, to Bhutan a few years ago, and there it's a whole different set of inheritances and a whole different set of environmental stresses. And again, the idea was, okay, so here's a Himalayan Buddhist kingdom with a real strong national culture around a form of Vajrayana Buddhism. And especially a tradition of sacred valleys. So what happens when sacred valleys are, which are protected, with these political protections, but also spiritually protected through associations with particular local divinities and these elaborate monastic rituals that maintain spiritual protection of these valleys. So what happens when those valleys are, for example, vulnerable to glacial outburst floods from melting glaciers? Like, not so much like what happens to the valley, but what happens to the tradition of interpreting the valley as sacred and protected. That was actually, of course, it's more complicated, ambivalent than I can really express in a concise way now. But the answers lead towards Bhutan's climate policy, which is, they present themselves as carbon negative. They have a massive conservation policy that is rooted in their interpretation of what the Buddhist heritage means for them. And I think they present themselves to the world as a sanctuary that's deserving of international protection. So they're drawing on a religious heritage to kind of craft a place of a political identity for them in a world in which climate change is a major flow.
Yeah, I can imagine the different stories emerging out of this kind of interaction of sacred places and climate change, especially when we in the Yellowstone case and the tradition of very broadly kind of American wilderness environmentalism, of thinking of these places as you say, refuges from city life and from other people, and they're kind of places where people don't go, or where the traces of human beings are imperceptible.
Right.
And climate change obviously disrupts that. There are no places in the world that are free of human traces. And does that if this is a word, desacralize the space? Does that make it less sacred? I mean, certainly the story that you raised with the climate modeler, taking and it's one thing to say, oh, we'll be inundating the New Jersey shore, and that's really harmful, and it's going to have these negative consequences, and maybe and for some people maybe that is a sufficiently salient example of climate change to be meaningful, but it's perhaps a different story to talk about wildfires in Yellowstone, a place that's supposed to be free and from from human influence, although that's like absurd. It's a hugely managed space. But in any case, I mean, so it seems like there are lots of complicated dynamics. There's one is that these spaces can be used as, in a sense, highly salient illustrations of the profound changes that are on the horizon. But there's also perhaps, a complicated dynamic where some of the meaning is sapped out of these spaces because, when we see them embedded in, the kind of broader industrial human landscape.
Yeah, so actually, that something like that dynamic is one that our teams have asked themselves in one way or another. Basically, will places that regard themselves as sacred, as sanctuaries, as they are shaped more and more by big pressures that originate from causes, outside of themselves, will their character be maintained? I think it's especially fraught for the American wilderness tradition, of course, because if you have a tradition that a place is unmarked by humans, and that is also what makes it special, then that's going to make it harder. It's going to make it harder to incorporate what look like exogenous influences or the constant pervasive hand of humans. But stepping back from the particular anxiety that causes, I think it's just really culturally interesting to mark what kinds of vocabularies of humanity and nature, human natural systems will come out of that pressure. So Yellowstone is this iconic place for American views of humanity and nature in a way that maybe the Jersey Shore isn't quite. And it everyone around the nation follows, its policy on wolves or snowmobiles or whatever, because it makes a difference for how we imagine all of our environments. And so it's just to say, what is interesting to me about this project is it really focuses in on those real sensitive cultural landscapes, because it knows that the kinds of vocabularies and the questions that arise from there are going to be ones by which we interpret the rest of our not our, but in this case, for Americans, the rest of their interactions with the climate changed world. And I would say that something like that is true, although it's different dynamics. They don't have the same, wilderness set of human nature binary exclusions. But something like that is true for the Bhutanese and their tradition of the Sacred Valley, the place that one goes for safety and enlightenment. I would love it. In my ideal world, you get great funding and you create a whole set of research teams doing this for UNESCO recognized sacred sites around the world, in part because it's a way of tracking these emerging vocabularies by which humans are simultaneously interpreting really rapid global environmental changes, but with all these really various cultural repertoires and inheritances. And I think that's that's a point of that's something that we kind of need to do better with. So especially in the big global reports, there's going to be talk about societies and cultural transitions and so on. But the language is always so austere, and it imagines kind of humans universally interacting with the planet universally. But that's of course, that's not how it happens. We're all culturally embedded, living in these stories, possessed of our lexicons. And I think if there's one thing the environmental humanities kind of stands for, or takes at its task, is the need to be able to kind of pay real time attention to this cultural, these many millions of cultural events that are happening as people just try to interpret these changes with whatever they have at hand.
Yeah, this is all fascinating. If there's any donors or NSF program officers listening to this podcast, Willis Jenkins is the guy to be in touch with. So I feel like the last question is maybe the most abstract. I just feel like I have to get your thoughts on this while I have you. I think maybe many folks would be interested in a scholar of environmental ethics and religion and climate change. Your thoughts, just generally on the political situation in the U.S. and how religion intersects with politics and with the environment, especially in the partisan dynamic, the incredibly unhelpful partisan dynamic that we have in the U.S. today. Obviously, we've been talking about the intersection of religion and climate change and the environment in a fairly nuanced way, and in a very kind of religiously pluralistic kind of mindset. But I'm just curious, just generally, if you've learned anything in your work that illuminates some of the ways that religion in public discourse in the United States and how it interacts with other affinities, geographic, partisan, and so on, to produce this really unhelpful dynamic. And is there any way that we can do anything about it?
Yeah. Wow. Okay. How long do we have, Mike?
5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Well. Okay. So. I would say, yeah, this is an active site of research. I mean, there's kind of a generation of not very helpful research that tried to answer the question of something like, does being religious make you anti-environmental? And that wasn't helpful for a number of reasons, including that researchers weren't always really clear what they meant by religious. But there's been better research that's come out around religion and climate change. And as I follow it, a couple findings are, one, it's complicated to disentangle religious and political identity, because in this country, our polarization has involved the polarization of religious identities, right? So, but I think one thing we can learn is, well, let me just mention a story and then say something about what I think is going on. So back in 2006, there was an evangelical declaration about climate change, and it was signed by, everybody, right? Presidents, colleges, all the big pastors, people were on TV. I think Falwell was on TV, with Al Sharpton. And then just 10 years later, in 2016, Trump withdraws from Paris and there's silence. Nothing, right? At the same time, back in 2006, there was this global assembly of evangelical Christians that they're called the Lausanne Conference, I think, that described climate change as one of the two gravest moral problems of our time, the other being human poverty. So, formally it looks like it's a problem, and then 10 years later in the United States it doesn't. So what happens? Sociologists are kind of uncovering the research. There's a couple things that are happening. I mean, one is there's pretty intentional, what do you want to say, like culture jamming, right? Like, so especially, white evangelicals were targeted by internal and external campaigns that attempted to kind of shame them into re-solidifying their alliance with, I guess you'd say, the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party was worried that if it lost its evangelical base, that it would really lose its power base. And climate change was seen as a wedge issue. And so you saw like these really kind of like clearly very well-funded programs that went after key pastors, basically saying that they were unintentionally losing their Christian identity. They were becoming pagan. They were giving their kids over to being pagan. And so maybe that worked. Maybe there are other things at play. Maybe that had nothing to do with it. But what you do see is that it's not right to say that evangelicals don't care about climate change. Right. What it is right to say is that white evangelicals who are U.S. citizens are much less likely to care about climate change. But black and brown evangelicals, much higher climate concern. Meanwhile, Catholics, which on the whole have a relatively higher concern towards climate change, also split by race. So white Catholics much more likely to be skeptical, whereas Hispanic Catholics are not only more likely, they're more likely than the American public in general, right? Sure. So what role is religion and playing? Like what role is evangelical Christian beliefs playing in there? It's really, you could be open to I would be open to a hypothesis that would say, well, not much, because it looks like race and political affiliation is doing more work. There is some more nuanced work inside of that, like about how religious affiliation affects how intensely and how the climate views are held and how open they might be to change. There's also really interesting international work. And this is really thin. I mean, so much of the religion and climate change work is focused on the United States, and there just isn't as much everywhere else, including the global South. But there is some, really interesting work that needs to be done comparatively. So just for example, in Brazil, evangelicals are way more likely to be climate concerned than others. And the reason for that, of course, is that evangelicals in Brazil they just occupy a totally different political space than evangelicals in the United States do. So that's just to say, okay, I just went on for a little bit there, but religion does a lot of different kinds of really particular work in different contexts, and you really have to have smart research to attend to it. And I just, here's a place where we just need so much more great social science to understand, because it clearly is playing a huge role. Yeah,
it's super interesting. I think that the two things there that really just strike me, the depth of the complexity of the situation, but also that there's other tails wagging this dog, and maybe just out of a kind of a cultural a proclivity, we tend to look to religion to provide explanations, when maybe that's, at least in certain contexts, not really the main driver. But nevertheless, there's hugely important issues around, like, at the very least, how people understand these issues and talk about them and think about them.
Yeah, I like what you just said. Like, sometimes I think, religion may not be like a huge causal explanation, but it is often the explanation that people will give. It's what they draw on to tell their story about why they did what they did.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Willis. This has been a super interesting conversation.
Mike, it was really fun. Thank you.